Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, for the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. Happy Tuesday to you all. We should have a great show ahead for you guys, getting you prepared for the start of the NFL season, and with it, fantasy football as well, in both respective sports, because today we are going to be looking a little bit at college football as well. Going to give you a little recap on week one, the goings on in terms of fantasy college football, but for the most part, the bulk of today's show lies in the NFL. We're going to be continuing to deep dive into certain skill position groups around the league that I think are going to be contentious in terms of fantasy implications. We're going to start off in the NFC East with the Washington Commanders, one of the more intriguing running back rooms in the NFL. Then we move to the Steelers and Titans. We take a quick break in terms of the NFL and switch to college football. And we conclude today's show with our first wide receiver room deep dive with the three-headed monster that is the Chicago Bears wide receiver room. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you, and you guys have been doing an incredible job with this, continue to avail yourselves to the many features that YouTube has to offer now that we are a live show, whether it be through Super Chat, Super Thanks, or Super Stickers. You can interact with the show, and I want you to interact with the show. That is what it's all about. We are getting closer to the start of the fantasy football season, so many of you may have questions, comments, or concerns about your team. We've been getting some great comments about your teams as you begin to draft, and some, in fact, trade analyses as well. So I want you to continue to do that. It just makes the show much more better. You can, if you want, and listen to me ramble on and on about my opinions, but I want your opinion because they matter to the show, and it makes them even better. And it also makes the show and the network go as well. We also take tips and donations as well, so if you do feel so inclined, that is an option as well. But you can, in whatever way you want, contribution is key for the success of this show. So thank you to all who are watching, but without further ado, let's jump right into the start of today's show. We're going to stick with this graphic here. We're going to be starting off with a running back room that I really am excited and thrilled to beginning to do a deep dive in, because a lot of people may not have been paying as much attention to it as I have. I think that it's going to be a very interesting kind of competition, very contentious competition between these two guys, two very distinct styles of play in this running back room for the Washington Commanders. But at the end of the day, I think they really complement each other well enough to sustain what should be a very sneaky good offense should rookie QB Jaden Daniels be their guy. So without further ado, let's talk about this running back room. And you can supplement me with comments if you so choose. I'll take any kind of comment from whoever's watching at the current moment. Let's start off with the presumptive starter, even though it was said that they were naming Brian Robinson Jr. the RB1 during camp. I still think that at least by a certain week early on in the season, say week 4 or 5, Austin Eckler could start. I think the main problem was just getting him back from that injury he sustained as an LA Charger, but he was acquired by the Washington Commanders from LA. And I think that he's one of those backs that is kind of in the nadir of his career. He is kind of declining, but he does offer that experience, that understanding of kind of a run-heavy scheme, even though in LA, in the Justin Herbert area, it became more pass-oriented. I think that this was kind of a perfect fit for Austin Eckler, even though he's going to not do as much in this offense as people would think. That being said, I still think he adds value as a mid-round sleeper, but only because of the fact that Brian Robinson Jr. just has a little bit more raw potential to him, and because in this system, he's going to cede a lot of the pass-catching opportunities. I don't think at this point in his career he's going to really help in the receiving game, but as a third down situational back, maybe more so in the red zone, he will get his touches. And he did score 38 touchdowns in 2021 and 2022, so make of that what you will. As T Money says, I'm back with another trade. Hit me, man, one of my favorite commenters on this show, my favorite subscribers on this show. So yes, T Money, please hit me with your trade before. Actually, he has it right here, as he says he's wishing to trade Laporta, London, and Connor for K9, A.J. Brown, and Jake Ferguson. This is a very similar trade to one. If you haven't been following the show, he has come up with a lot of interesting trades for me to ponder over the past couple of weeks. This one really is another one that's highly similar to others that he's done, but I think that this one could potentially work. Laporta, London, and Connor for Kenneth Walker, A.J. Brown, and Jake Ferguson. We talked a little bit about A.J. Brown and Jake Ferguson in the profile of this trade before. And Laporta, London, and Connor is an interesting group to trade away because obviously I have my strong opinions about Sam Laporta. Well, he was the tight end one last year, was the worst tight end one season in recent memory. That being said, he represents a kind of youthful movement in the evolutionary stages of the tight end position. Then Drake London, also very promising, has had 1,000-yard seasons with inconsistent QB play. And then, of course, James Conner. But a reason why I like the upside of this trade more is because a lot of people are sleeping on Kenneth Walker. And as a Seahawks fan, I'm not just saying that because of bias. Whenever I talk about the Seattle Seahawks, I never wish to come from a point of bias. I truly believe that a lot of people are sleeping on Kenneth Walker. He has great open field ability. Thank you for the tap to learn. Getting back to this trade, he has great open field ability, contact balance as well. I still think that he has room to grow for him in the Seattle offense. And while it certainly is going to look a little bit more pass-oriented in my opinion, I still think Kenneth Walker adds a lot of value. A.J. Brown, we talked about him as well. Very important receiver. Maybe going to cede a couple of targets to Devontae Smith. So there is that concern. But I still think he's a solid receiver that a lot of people are sleeping on. And Jake Ferguson. I talk about him a lot as one of those boomer bust guys. He has a lot of potential as to be a red zone threat. But at the end of the day, how much value is he going to add in open space, in the open field for this Cowboys team? So it's a very interesting trade. That being said, call me crazy, but I would accept it. Because at the end of the day, the players who we are getting have a lot of upside value compared to guys like Laporta and London who feel like they are going to decline in the system. I just feel like Laporta can't continue consistently putting up tight end one type seasons, no matter how bad they are. And then Drake London, I just think he needs to rely too much upon Kirk Cousins being the guy in Atlanta. And K9, A.J. Brown, and Jake Ferguson are all in upside offenses. I still have my doubts about A.J. Brown, but I still think this is a solid trade. So this trade I would accept if I were UT Money. Thank you for this trade. But back to the look of this Washington Commanders running back room, and back to Austin Eckler. Like I said, he did have an injury history in his final season with the LA Chargers, suffered a high ankle sprain. Maybe that's why there was not too much hype surrounding him in Commanders camp. But he did have, make of this what you will, 5 top 10 finishes in 14 games he played last season for the LA Chargers. So he's not necessarily, quote-unquote, steadily declining, but there is worry as he's getting older, as he's in his age 29 season, as to how he profiles in an offense looking to become a sneaky good one in the NFL and in the NFC East. Let's go to the actual starter here. My mistake in terms of thinking about him. As Tap to Learn says, another trade, Josh Allen and Keenan Allen for Lamar and Puka. I immediately say no to this trade. And it's funny because Josh Allen and Lamar are so close to each other. They're so close to each other in terms of their play style. But the reason why I say no to this trade is because while Keenan Allen and Puka Nacua, one is much older and more experienced in a wide receiver room that's very competitive, which we'll talk about later, and the other is very high upside in terms of how he looks, one of the best rookie seasons as a wide receiver ever. I just think that this year I'm looking at the teams they're in and the excitement around them, and in terms of Josh Allen and Keenan Allen, Josh Allen has a lot of weight off his shoulders. He doesn't have to worry with the tension that Stephon Diggs creates, and I truly think that he's going to limit his turnovers, which has always been the big issue with him in terms of fantasy production. Whereas Lamar, I really think that this whole Derrick Henry acquisition is really throwing me for a loop here, because I don't really know how this offense is going to look now that's not a committee approach that kind of allows Lamar more opportunities to do RPOs, get more creative with this offense. I think that Derrick Henry acquisition really limits them on offense, really. And then Keenan Allen and Puka Nacua. I actually think Keenan Allen will have the worst fantasy wide receiver, but not receiving season, but not to like foreshadow one of my future segments, but he was the wide receiver 3 last year. Did have his second best fantasy season. It may have been because he was an LA Charger and not a Chicago Bear, where there's going to be a huge question about the target share there, but it's still something. And Puka is now in a situation where he doesn't necessarily have much leeway now because of the return of Cooper Kupp. Maybe someone like a Kyron Williams, who I'm definitely not that high on, will have a breakout season yet again. I'm still very skeptical of what he brings to the table for the LA Rams, but overall I'm not that excited about this trade. So I immediately say, do not trade these Josh Allen and Keenan Allen for Lamar and Puka Nacua. And it may be very interesting and kind of skeptical to say, but I still don't think that this trade makes a ton of sense when you look at the numbers. You look at the profiles of the teams as well. But to kind of finish off this segment, talk about Brian Robinson Jr. very briefly. Is projected to be the RB1 in this system. He did have the same amount of fantasy points last year as Austin Eckler in terms of average, 13.2. And I still think that the reason why Brian Robinson is the starter is because of the profile of Cliff Kingsbury in this offense. I think that this whole kind of mentality that Cliff Kingsbury brings as the offensive coordinator, coming from Texas Tech, working with Kyler Murray in Arizona, being like this air raid guy, kind of plays into Brian Robinson Jr.'s hands, which is why he was named the starter. I think he has more explosiveness, more receiving abilities, more upside in that regard, and so that's why he's the starter. But at the end of the day, this is my prediction. I did say, this was before, the names were named for the starting roles. Eckler was starting, but heavy workload for Robinson, and it still could ring true, right? Eckler could kind of maintain the starting role in the middle of the season, but expect Brian Robinson to give you a heavy workload. And in many regards, if you're in a PPR league, he might just offer you that higher upside. That being said, I think it would make more sense to start the experienced hand. Cliff Kingsbury thinks otherwise. Let me know what you think in the comments, but that'll just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we'll be looking at another running back room of contention, going over to the AFC and the Pittsburgh Steelers. We'll be right back after the break to talk about them.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you that if you do feel so inclined, you can make yourselves available to all the features that YouTube has to offer, whether it be through Super Chat, Super Thanks, or Super Stickers. It is a huge support to me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. You could also consider leaving tips and donations. Keep your questions and comments coming. They're always good. I love interacting with you guys through the chat. So if you feel so inclined, please consider doing that because it just makes this show that much more better. Your insight makes my insight and the content of the show so much more great. So keep doing that. Without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment of today's show. And this is another running back room of contention. We switch from the NFC to the AFC with this one. It's always been a huge debate surrounding this room, and it could be the X factor this year for this particular team because of the profile of their offense. There's not much excitement surrounding it, even though they have two QBs who might work out, one with a little bit more upside than the other in terms of long-term success. But the overarching sentiment when it comes to this offense is that it really does not have that many weapons. So the running back room is definitely going to be scrutinized very heavily as the season goes on. And that is the running back room of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And everyone seems to be talking about, is it going to be Najee Harris or Jaylen Warren? Well, I'm here to tell you that I think that the direction of this running back room is going in a way that could really help the Steelers. And here's why. Let's start off with both of these guys and kind of comparing them. So Jaylen Warren did have a hamstring injury last year, but he's expected to be ready for the season opener, and I think that at the end of the day, there's a lot of excitement surrounding him. Let's talk about the presumptive starter and Najee Harris a little bit more to start this conversation going. He had 569 snaps in 2023. He had, I believe, 1,335 yards, and I think that ultimately you would take that. But let's consider this. In a smaller sample size, Warren had 519 snaps, 784 yards, kind of a third down change of pace back, but with that, he had 61 receptions on 74 targets for 370 yards. So make of that what you will. I think that in a smaller sample size, it would be more appealing for you to look at Jaylen Warren. But at the end of the day, Najee Harris is kind of one of those bulk backs in that he gets a lot of touches, maybe a little bit more production in the long run, but in terms of the upside of this offense and the efficiency that I might want to use early on in the season, Jaylen Warren could be their guy. And even though Najee Harris has a nice little profile in terms of PPR, 228.6 PPR fantasy points last year and ranked second in the league in broken tackles, the reason why I'm so high on Jaylen Warren is because of the fact that Najee Harris get a little bit more touches in the open field. Jaylen Warren might be the guy to just finish the job. And in situational football, where the Steelers might need that change of pace, might need a guy, should Russell Wilson, who was named the starter, kind of get into this rut, Jaylen Warren just seems like the guy to get him out of it because of his explosiveness and his abilities in the receiving game. But the biggest caveat surrounding the Steelers offense, as we get another update here, picking 10th in a 12-team league, says tap to learn, looking at A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, or Jonathan Taylor. Which one do you like? Well, let me be clear here. In a 12-team league, all of these guys kind of project as high second-round players. There may be some guys who might fall to you at 10, but I think it is apt to include some of these guys. That being said, I think that Jonathan Taylor makes the most sense, especially if the way your draft is going leans more wide receiver heavy. Say there's a big cluster of wide receivers after McCaffrey's and Halls are gone that go at least say 5 through 8 or so. I think it would set the precedent to pick a Jonathan Taylor to really set the standard that you kind of want to steer the direction of the draft, even though you have a lower draft pick. So zig where there's zag is kind of what I'm saying. Even though A.J. Brown and Garrett Wilson would be apt picks in the latter half of the first round, getting into the early stages of the second round. So Jonathan Taylor would be my pick there. A lot of upside with him. We talked about him a lot on the show. In that Colts offense, probably going to be a little bit more expected to carry the load should Anthony Richardson take a while to transition and get back into the starting QB in the NFL mindset. So I like that pick. But getting back to the Steelers as a whole, I think the main caveat with them, as I was saying before the comment, is that it's not the running backs. It's the offensive coordinator. And we all know what Arthur Smith does with his running backs, if he uses them to any effect at all. So I'm not criticizing what Arthur Smith is going to do with this offense, but he's not the most appealing when it comes to incorporating running backs in nice ways. That being said, I like the fact that in Atlanta, he did recognize that Tyler Algier had something to offer. So when I compare what he did in Atlanta with what he did in Pittsburgh, maybe that kind of favors Najee Harris a little bit, because Algier is more on the ground and pound guy, and that's what I think of Harris at this current moment in time. Then you have a guy like Bijan, who he didn't use as much, but when he did use him, it was used to great effect. Got a lot of scrimmage yards out of him. Did use him very much so in the receiving game. So I think my prediction for this running back room will be that Harris will get the bulk of the carries. But Warren is more of a weapon in the receiving game. That being said, I still think in the open field, Najee Harris could get some receiving looks as well, especially if you want to shorten the passes for Russell Wilson in this offense, because I think that the idea of this Pittsburgh Steelers offense kind of simplifying things really leads to Russell Wilson as well. I think what he did in Denver was too much. I think that in the second season in Denver, where he played a little bit more freely, kind of alluded to the fact that he wants to continue doing that, but as he gets older, I think that the running ability is going to get a little bit lost to the wayside here. And in this offense, there could be some mouths to feed that, should he not, then Mike Tomlin might look for Justin Fields. It might be cliche because Justin Fields also brings a dual threat ability. But I think the reason why Mike Tomlin went with Russell Wilson is A, he feels like the safer pick at this point, and B, he does definitely bring a little bit more arm talent to the position. And so, seeing as to how this running back room has kind of this weird opportunity to develop into pass catchers that plays into what Najee Harris can then take with him in terms of finding a more open space. But I still think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to Russell Wilson himself being able to diagnose how these running backs are playing and just going with the hot hand here. And the hot hand may tend to be Jaylen Warren, especially if they put together more red zone drives. As Tackler says, if I have either of these guys that are on my bench and maybe a desperation flex, I completely agree with that sentiment. I think that in a deeper PPR league, Warren might make a little bit more sense, but at the end of the day, the contention surrounding this Steelers running back room stems from the fact that they may have to get desperate to really incorporate both of these guys' versatilities into this offense. And with Arthur Smith and what he brings, I don't necessarily see it as much. But If anything, I think in the receiving game they could really help. That being said, if you start Najee Harris over Jalen Warren, you're going to see more stagnation in terms of ground and pound style. And I don't necessarily think the Steelers want to be that. So I completely agree with that sentiment, Tap to learn. But to kind of sum up why I'm bringing up the Steelers running back room, it's mainly because in that AFC, and especially the AFC North landscape, when you have two guys who are not necessarily quote-unquote committee guys, they have these roles, it's going to come down to the logistics of the offensive setup. And I know that it's going to be weird, especially with Pittsburgh, considering the fact that they're not necessarily known for the offensive side of the ball. But it's going to come down to how Arthur Smith really sees these two running backs and how he utilizes them. That's all I can really say. I don't necessarily think they're fantasy studs. They could represent upside in deep leagues, and they may be some desperation flexes or streams like Tap to Learn says. But don't count on them, really having settled roles that you can rely upon week in, week out. So, that's my ultimate diagnosis of them. I think Najee Harris will start, but I think at the end of the day, if I'm looking towards the future, Jalen Warren could be an appealing guy a couple years down the road, should he start to get a little bit more starting touches. But that should just about do it. Thank you for the comments for the segment. Coming up next, we go to another running back room that I really like, and I think has a lot more upside than the two that I mentioned in terms of how these two guys pan out. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about them as well.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We're going to continue with our deep dives into certain skill position groups, and this one is kind of one I'm really excited about, a little bit more so than the others I've mentioned today, but it also has its questions as well, and concerns, most importantly. This is a running back room that really profiles as potentially optimistic one in terms of who they have, but it all come crashing down because this is a team that's really in a weird period of their kind of prospective histories. They're in a division that's really starting to catch up with the times, and if they want to be a part of the reckoning in this division, then they may have to rely on these running backs as well. And without further ado, that leads to the naming of this team in the Tennessee Titans and the two running backs they have here, starting off with the guy who they acquired and who is the one I have more questions about, Tony Pollard. And the reason why I have more questions about Tony Pollard than Tyjae Spears is this. We have seen Tony Pollard time in and time again really start to be considered as one of those running backs you can rely upon, especially in fantasy. Last year, 6 TDs, 1,005 yards, but there's always this sense around him that there could be more to him than we already see. That's the question that a lot of pundits are asking about. Is he the running back that in 2022 was a Pro Bowler for the Cowboys, or is he the running back that last year saw kind of decline in important stats in terms of determining whether or not he can be a good fantasy player? And so that's where the bulk of the questions concerning who Tony Pollard is and how he profiles to his new team in the Tennessee Titans really falls. Because Tyjae Spears, as young as he is, only in his second year in the league, I think that upside with him and Levis really plays into that youth in the backfield, and also allows for Will Levis to really use and exploit positively the experienced receivers he has in Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins. So, out of all the running back acquisitions, outside of, say, the Derrick Henrys and Joe Mixons, this one is also one that gives me pause in terms of how this goes along the road for the Tennessee Titans. Because when I look at the AFC South, they're really in a weird position in it, because they're not necessarily in an advantageous position because of them looking up at teams like the Texans and the Jaguars. But I don't necessarily think that acquiring Tony Pollard really helps them. In fact, I could go so far as to say it hinders the development of Tyjae Spears and kind of loses that young and youthful bond that Will Levis and Tyjae Spears was building in the backfield. So, I don't know what to make about all this Tony Pollard business. Let me know what you think in the comments, because I think that there is still a Pro Bowler caliber player within him, but I'm tentative to see how it translates to the Tennessee Titans, a team that looks like and seems like it wants to go forward. In terms of going forward, I think that Tyjae Spears was always going to be a guy who I really liked. And it kind of sucks to see this team kind of hinder that. Because if Tyjae Spears started, yeah, there would be questions about a second-year guy getting that much carries in this unit. But remember, he had almost 150 carries and touches in the Titans system last year. So I think he's ready to be thrown into the fire. I've spoken of his many and sung many of his praises on this show before, and I really think that he gives Will Levis a reliable, competent target that, most importantly, Will Levis himself feels comfortable with. Last year, 9th most targets amongst all running backs, more than 800 scrimmage yards. And if you're in a PPR league, of Superflex league, he could be worth taking a flyer on in the mid-rounds, maybe like a 5th or 6th round pick. And he can slot in immediately as your RB2 or as a flex player. I really think that I can't make much heads or tails about deciphering what's going to go on in the future, in the long term for this Tennessee Titans room. But I know one thing. If they keep Tyjae Spears in-house for many years, I think that he will eventually become their starting running back. And it worries me to see that they don't necessarily see it. The organization doesn't necessarily see it enough that they bring in Tony Pollard for that level of competition. So it really is weird. And before we get to my prediction, I think that, if I were the general manager of the Tennessee Titans, I would be worried that I might have just made the wrong mistake here. Because think about it. Both Will Levis and Tyjae Spears still have a couple years left in their rookie deals. You don't necessarily have to worry about them. Investing money in a guy like Tony Pollard, who, while is quote-unquote proven in this league, has had a couple good seasons with the Dallas Cowboys, he is also getting up there in age, and he also doesn't feel like he's getting with the times. As Splash Bro says, Pollard and Spears definitely flex until they show us something in weeks 1 through 3. Yeah, that's exactly what I kind of feel, right? I still have more hope in Spears, like I said, but until I really know what this Titans offense is going to try to do, I'm not necessarily sure. And the reason why I'm also more unsure about the overall look at the Titans offense is their new offensive coordinator, Nick Holtz. Really hasn't made a name for himself enough to get as much of a prominent role as the Titans offensive coordinator. He spent many years in the league. He was a passing game coordinator for Jacksonville, so he knows the division at the very least. Spent the time with Oakland when they were the Oakland Raiders. Spent some time in college as well. But at the end of the day, I don't necessarily think the Tennessee Titans are in a place that really can use the potential of these running backs. I think that Tony Pollard will only decline more and more if there's no understanding of what this offense is. And Tyjae Spears' development might be halted a little bit. But my utmost prediction is this. And it could be that this prediction comes back in my face a couple of weeks down the road because Tyjae Spears isn't the fantasy sleeper who I really thought he was. I think that Spears will be the fantasy star, even though Pollard's the starter. And the reason why I think this is, when I look at the Titans and what they could potentially be, I think that they're going to utilize Will Levis a lot more in this offense than people think. They're going to utilize Will Levis's one true trait, his arm strength, that's really exciting about him. And I think they're going to use his moxie to his advantage. Nick Holtz seems like a hire as the OC. From the very little I know about him, that's worked with wide receivers, very experienced in his knowledge of them, to my understanding. So he's really going to try and develop that aspect of the Titans game. When I look at Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears, I just think Tyjae Spears, out of the backfield, knowing Will Levis after one season, will understand his tendencies, at least in the receiving game, a little bit more. As Splash Bro says, who would you flex this week? George Pickens or Tank Dell? And this is an interesting one because both of these games these guys are playing, and this is what I look at in terms of who we would start week in, week out in terms of matchups. Both of these guys are playing in very under-the-radar games as the Steelers play the Falcons and the Texans are in the division against the Colts. So, defense-wise, I'm looking at the Falcons and the Colts very similar. Very underrated defenses. The Falcons adding a little bit more juice with Matthew Judon coming into the system. Having A.J. Terrell as well. Their linebacker core looking like one of the deepest in the league. And then look at the Colts as well. They have a fantastic linebacker core as well. E.J. Speed, Sire Franklin. I really like the young depth they have in the secondary with a guy like Juju Brents as well. So it's really going to come down to the quarterbacks that are throwing the football. At the end of the day, C.J. Stroud is ultimately better than Russell Wilson. I don't know if Russell Wilson will look comfortable in his Steelers debut on the road against the Falcons, but I do know that C.J. Stroud will want to make a statement, especially against a division rival who really took them to the end last season in terms of the divisional race. So I think that C.J. Stroud will be more hungry. He's going to come out swinging. So I like Tank Dell, even though he's not necessarily going to be a wide receiver too in this offense. As Tap to Learn also says, start London or Davante Adams. I actually think that Davante Adams, as cliche as it is to sound, in a game that could see a lot of running attempts as the Raiders face the Chargers, will be the X factor in that game. So I think you should start Davante Adams, but back to Splash Bro, I think Dell as well. So Dell for Splash Bro's comment, and Tap to Learn's comment Adams, because I actually think that he is the X factor here for that whole makeup of the game, because he is the receiver that will make the difference in that game. Because on the Chargers side, I don't see anyone making the difference. But back to the conclusion of my analysis of the Titans running back room. Yeah, the reason why I think Tyjae Spears has this star ability again, the rapport with Will Levis is very important. He knows his tendencies. And an offense with an offensive coordinator in Nick Holtz, who prides, at the very least, knowing some wide receivers, knowing their tendencies. I think he will get the most out of a receiving back rather than a guy like Tony Pollard. But Tony Pollard is just interesting in the volume of carries and targets he may get and touches in the system. It just needs to translate time and time again, consistently over a period of time for me to really believe it. And I don't want to believe it because I think that Tyjae Spears was already good enough to be a starter on his own in the Tennessee Titans offensive scheme. But that will just about do it for this segment. Thank you guys yet again for all your comments as well. I appreciate them. But coming next, we actually transition from the NFL to college football, doing a little bit of a fantasy recap of some fantasy stars in college football over this past week one. We'll be right back to recap that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys are enjoying this show thus far. We are going to take a little bit of a break from our deep dives into NFL skill position groups that I think have fantastically fascinating fantasy implications. And we are going to deep dive into college football. Week 1 of the college football season was underway last Saturday. And a lot of interesting storylines, a lot of interesting performances around the college football landscape, a lot of new guys, a lot of intrigue surrounding young freshmen, a lot of intrigue surrounding established veterans as well. So I think that the guys have chosen may lead to some tension and skepticism in the comments. Let me know what you think as we go along this list, position by position, of some guys that I really liked. But ultimately, these are the guys who I would want on my fantasy college football team. Not necessarily quote-unquote stars who stat padded or whatever throughout the week. There are some, though. I just think these are guys who, if you do play fantasy college football, you might not want to overlook in terms of their abilities to get the job done, is what I'm trying to say. So without further ado, let's jump right into this kind of college football Week 1 fantasy recap. Let's start off at the QB position. I have two guys here that really stood out to me. Maybe not just because of their stats and production, because of what they did with their offenses. And two offenses that really will profile as two of the more intriguing ones in the SEC. And let's start off with the younger of the two guys. How about Nico Iamaleava, the redshirt freshman at Tennessee, and the keys to the car for the Tennessee offense. And he, albeit against Chattanooga, lit up. He had 28.2 FanDuel's fantasy points, 22 of 28 passing, 314 yards, 3 TDs, looked very comfortable distributing the ball, 11.2 yards per attempt. Now, like I said, it was against Chattanooga. Tennessee will have a lot more tests, including in Week 2, where we will talk about this later in the week as they take on NC State, a top 25 opponent. But Nico Iamaleava gained confidence from this game. It's not going to be important. It's not going to be a game on his resume that NFL scouts will be pointing to in 3 or 4 years' time. But it proves that you can't overlook guys who have promise, even though they may have a tough go of it. And Nico Iamaleava will have a tough go of it. As Tap to Learn said, Ashton Jeanty blew doors off for Boise State. Wish I had him. We'll get to him later because he is someone who I really like, especially in that group of 5 conversation. But back to Nico for the time being. I think this kid has a lot of upside. He has a lot of potential. And this Tennessee offense might go a little bit underrated. They have veterans in Squirrel White and Brew McCoy at the wide receiver position. So if Nico Iamaleava shows the composure and the poise and he showed against an FCS opponent and translates it to the SEC, he will be as good as gold. But the next QB, you might be very mad at me for including him. And I promise this isn't Texas bias. This is just based off what I see and how he operated the system this week against Colorado State and how I think he will translate throughout the season. It is Quinn Ewers. Only had 20.8 fantasy points, 20 of 27, 260 yards, 3 TDs, 9.6 yards per attempt. And I know what you're thinking. Don't let bias get to your head. But this bias aside, I think that this performance when Quinn Ewers was important not just in the fantasy realm and what he's going to look like as a fantasy QB in his final year at Texas, but it just shows how in that Texas offense, all he needed to do was kind of relax. And I think that even though they're adding so many transfer pieces after they lost so much production in last year's draft, the thing about Quinn Ewers is that he's just a steady hand who now understands Sark's setup enough that he can keep his composure and poise and have it translate to effective stats. And it may not be the prettiest stats at the end of the day. It may not be the yardage production of some of the guys this week. But it's important to understand the nuances of the QB position in fantasy college football and fantasy football as a whole. You're not necessarily looking for guys that put up 30 points or stat pad. I want a guy with balance, and Quinn Ewers showed that balance this week. So those are my two guys that really impressed me in terms of the quarterback position. Let's go back to Tap to Learn's comment, because Ashton Jeanty was absolutely ridiculous. And the reason I included him is A, because he was absolutely ridiculous, and B, he may be a guy that a lot of people might not have had on their radar for fantasy college football because of the fact he plays for Boise State. And even though they're one of the higher profile Group of 5 teams, they really had a lot of storylines this offseason, like the acquisition of Malachi Nelson. So I really think that Ashton Jeanty was able to go on the radar, but this weekend he really proved himself as one of the best running backs, all-purpose, what-have-you players in college football. And 20 carries, 267 yards for 6 TDs, 13.7 yard average on his carries. And I know what you're thinking. Chris, why are we talking about a Boise State running back if you know there are other running backs like Ollie Gordon, perhaps, who are getting talked about more and more people know about? Well, I want to introduce you to Ashton Jeanty. That's the point of this. This is a guy who I felt like coming into the season was not getting the respect he deserved. And this Boise State system, all the rumblings in the offseason, Malachi Nelson is going to transfer this program at quarterback and stuff like that. A lot of people may have forgotten that Ashton Jeanty, at the end of the day, is one of, if not the best all-purpose player in college football. I said it. I said it about a Group of 5 guy. And if Boise State want to compete for a 12-team playoff spot and an at-large bid as one of the 6 conference champions, they're going to need to rely on Ashton Jeanty to expect a lot more of these stat lines out of him. And in fact, they needed every yard from him as well. It was a close game against Georgia Southern, actually. So they did need every yard for him. So look for him to get a lot of yardage production. But I think that at the running back position, as far as I'm concerned, no one comes close to touching him. He is, in fact, the only running back who I'm going to say merits mentioning in that system. Let's go to the excitement of the wide receivers. And this is a guy who everyone knows I love on this show. If you've been watching the past couple of episodes, or even way back to when I started this show, when we talk about fantasy college football, this was a wide receiver who I really liked. There's no really special attribute about this guy. He's not necessarily that speedy. He's not necessarily one of the best route runners. He's just a boundary receiver who has a high IQ. He's worked with his QB since middle school, actually. And that rapport really has carried them far throughout their careers. And that is Tetairoa McMillan of Arizona. And I looked at his performance. It was not the prettiest, but the reason why I feel like not only is he the best wide receiver in college football, but potentially the wide receiver 1 in the 25 NFL draft, is because of his ability to understand players by understanding his experiences with them. And I know that he won't have Noah Fafita in the NFL, but the reason why Tetairoa McMillan will succeed at the NFL level is because of his intelligence. That's what separates him from some wide receivers outside of Arizona and outside of the national profile. 10 receptions in their game, 304 yards, 4 touchdowns, 30.4 yard average on his catches. That is ridiculous. And so, Ted McMillan, you may have known about him in fantasy implications for fantasy college football because of the way I talk about him so highly, but he's a guy who, in the long run, in the NFL next year, could be a sneaky mid-round pick or a flyer off your bench as a waiver wire option, because I think that Ted McMillan will translate very well to the NFL. So he's a guy. But let's talk about someone from this freshman wide receiver class. A lot of hype surrounding them. A lot of freshmen making their college football debut this weekend. We talk about Jeremiah Smith and the excitement he brings to Ohio State. We talk about Ryan Wingo actually leading Texas in receiving yards. But the guy who won the day for me was Ryan Williams out of Alabama, because he only had 2 catches. And his 2 catches were 84-yard and 55-yard touchdowns for 139 yards and 2 TDs. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Alabama offense, it's always going to be good, so the targets will get distributed. I know that Kendrick Law and Kobe Prentice have been there for a while, but it does kind of give you hope and optimism that an Alabama receiver might be a true wide receiver 1 for you, because I think about them now as one of those teams that will rely on distributing the wealth, because Jalen Milroe can be very good in that regard for them. But having a guy like Ryan Williams who can just, on a dime, get 2 catches, 2 touchdowns, and long ones at that, really speaks to the abilities that Kalen DeBoer is trying to get out of these wide receivers and have them translate to their play on the field. So I was really excited about that. But overall, the college football landscape, man, very exciting. And now that this is a 12-team playoff, this could be one of the wackiest seasons. A lot of big stat lines could happen, continue to happen. Because not just these guys that I mentioned. There were guys that I could have mentioned as well. As Splash Bro says, it's the first ever college football trade, a fantasy college football trade. Ooh, I love this. I got an offer of a Buka for a Strepa. I love this trade offer. Because here's why. Emeka Buka is seen as one of, if not the best wide receiver right now in college football. There's a lot of hype around him. Coming back, not having Marvin Harrison look over his shoulder anymore. So, a lot of hype was surrounding him. But the question was, will Will Howard be able to get him the football? And from what we saw in that game against Akron, while it definitely looked like their second half was indicative of what their season could be like as this offense gets more fluidity, Will Howard, I don't necessarily trust as much as what I saw out of Cam Ward, who looked really fantastic in that game against Florida. And Xavier Strepo, let's not forget about him. He's also a high-end wide receiver. Been around the block a lot. Been in Miami for so long. Waited for a quarterback. Much like, say, comparison to Drake London in the NFL. Just waiting for that consistent QB play to come. So I really like this. If I'm you, I'm immediately scooping up Restrepo. I love him. I love Miami. They're now the cream of the crop in the ACC at this current moment. Their best hope for the playoff, I believe. So Xavier Restrepo for Emeka Buka. I really like that. That's a steal. And I think that you will get and be very glad to get a guy like Xavier Restrepo on your fantasy team. So that's a fantastic trade. The first college football trade. Thank you, Splash Bro, for that comment. But overall, college football is going to be very exciting. If you do get the opportunity to play fantasy college football, please do keep commenting, much like Splash Bro just did, about any offers you receive, because even though it's not as popular as fantasy football, and when we're getting into the fantasy football season, I really want to talk about it as much as possible, because this is going to be a very excitable fantasy college football year. But that's just about do it for this segment. Coming up for our last segment of today's show, we actually look at our first ever wide receiver room in terms of these deep dives. It is a 3-headed monster that's going to be the talk of the league. We'll be right back after the break to talk about that to close out today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of today's show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And it is our first ever deep dive into a wide receiver room in the NFL. Now, this wide receiver room has been talked about a lot in terms of how the target share will look in the setup. But I think that how you view this wide receiver room will translate to each of these guys' main attributes and how they appeal to A, quarterback Caleb Williams, and B, a guy who I'm all too familiar with as a Seattle Seahawks fan, new offensive coordinator Shane Waldron for the Chicago Bears. So let's do a little deep dive into this Bears wide receiver. Talk about DJ Moore. His first season as a Chicago Bear, topped 1,000 yards. A career year for him at 15 end zone targets, sixth most amongst all wide receivers. And to top it off, he had a very high, I believe, 37% air yard share as well. That just goes to show that his first season in Chicago Bears uniform was very comfortable for him. But now you add one of the most experienced wide receivers in the NFL entering his age 32 season in Keenan Allen in the mix. Also top 1,000 yards. Second best fantasy season of his career at age 31. Wide receiver 3 in fantasy. And yes, he was an aberration of the LA Chargers, one of the best receivers, one of the bright lights for them last season. Always a reliable target, Keenan Allen. But it does merit consideration that if Keenan Allen could continue to do this with a guy who's projected to be very similar, maybe even better than a guy like Justin Herbert and Caleb Williams, what's the floor for a guy like Keenan Allen if he should reproduce and replicate some of the numbers that he had in his age 31 season from LA? And then, of course, you draft 9th overall, kind of as a contingency pick in the draft, guy who's worked with Caleb Williams in the offseason, especially in college for quite some time, and Rome Odunze, who also topped 1,000 receiving yards, albeit at the University of Washington and not at the NFL level just yet. So, this three-headed monster that I'm talking about, Moore, Odunze, Keenan Allen, a lot of people might be saying, well, I might want to stay away from this receiver room because a receiver room like this, you can't necessarily truly project how many targets each of these guys will get. But I say otherwise. I say you should go deep into it, diagnosing how this wide receiver room could pan out, because this wide receiver room is so talented. No matter who gets the lion's share of targets in this wide receiver room, it's definitely going to be one that produces a lot of good stats, especially in fantasy. So let's start off with DJ Moore, a guy who I drafted. I believe I drafted him in the 5th or 6th round in my draft. I wasn't scared of him because I said, hey, DJ Moore, yes, he's going to have a lot of competition. Yes, he's going to have to contend with the fact that Odunze brings that rookie kind of touch and magic. Caleb Williams worked with him in the offseason. Keenan Allen just brings his level of experience. His many years in the league. I believe this is his 11th season as an NFL starting wide receiver. I'm kind of not the biggest commodity anymore, even though I had the experience of playing with Chicago Bears system. But I still think that DJ Moore profiles as the wide receiver 1 because of the fact that he's not necessarily just walking the walk of boasting his experience as Chicago Bear. He really is a truly good wide receiver, whether it be his speed, his versatility, his verticality, his route running abilities. I truly believe in DJ Moore. And I think that whether or not he gets the lion's share of the targets, he will still be, in my mind, the Bears wide receiver 1. And then let's talk about Allen, because Allen can really line up anywhere. I like him kind of more in the slot because of his savvy and ability to be a solid route runner. For Caleb Williams, a guy who can get open by using route running, using the complexities of the playbook, and going beyond, just what he sees on the field. That's why I think that Keenan Allen's also going to be an option. I don't necessarily think he's going to be the wide receiver 3 this year because, come on, a lot of people in their age 32 seasons do show signs of decline, even though 6 of them since 2000 have had 20-plus fantasy points averaged in their age 32 seasons. I just can't see Keenan Allen immediately transferring to the Chicago Bears, no matter how promising they look, and being a wide receiver 1 at his current age. With that being said, he definitely brings the most experience out of anyone on this lineup. And then Rome Odunze, because he is the biggest question mark. He will have the most to prove out of all of these wide receivers. I think that what I really loved about him at the University of Washington is his body control. Out of all of these guys, I think that he can really exploit defenses with the way he understands the path of the football. And I think that he's going to be a huge deep threat. His verticality as well. He's not the fastest guy, but I still think that he projects as their best deep threat in this offense. So that's just my analysis. Let me know what you think in the comments if you think otherwise. But when I look at them as a trio, and I look at, like I said, the new offensive coordinator in Shane Waldron, who I'm not too fondly familiar with at Seattle, but definitely has a lot of experience in this league nonetheless. I think that there is opportunity here for Caleb Williams to really kind of parse out who best fits the profile of making me most comfortable as a passer. Who will I always know will get open early and often for me and set the precedent for me as a rookie quarterback, because that's still what he is. As otherworldly as people make him sound, he still is a rookie quarterback, and he hasn't proven anything to us at the NFL level just yet. So, with these 3 weapons, if I'm Shane Waldron, who has used so many 3 wide receiver sets, not to great effect in Seattle, but who has used so many 3 wide receiver sets, here's what I would do. I would, as Poet Sears and Sages says, DJ or DK for flex. Don't tempt me here, because both of these guys have been screwed over by, or will be screwed over by, Shane Waldron. So this is a weird question because I like both of them. Okay, I think that right now DK isn't the better setup in terms of how many targets he could see, and I just don't know with DJ Moore. But I still can underestimate DJ Moore. But at the end of the day, I would take DK, and it's not my Seattle bias. I would take DK as my flex option because of, his ability. And also, he's never really failed in terms of where he's finished at season's end in terms of fantasy positioning. He's always been kind of that wide receiver 15 to 20 range, whereas DJ Moore could tend for more volatility. And getting back to DJ Moore, I think that DJ Moore, out of all these receivers, could line up anywhere. And that's what makes him really more of a wide receiver 1 than people think. Because of his ability to line up outside, line up in the slot, really be creative in terms of how he aligns. So that just goes to show the diversity that he could bring. Shane Waldron just has to use it correctly, unlike what he did in Seattle. But that's enough of me complaining about Shane Waldron. Rome Odunze, I think his role is simplest. Just be that deep threat. Go long. If Caleb wants to connect vertically, if you believe you have a matchup, a mismatch, whether it be a third-string corner or someone like that, go long with Rome Odunze. And hopefully that connection between him and Caleb Williams shows out in that regard. And with Keenan Allen, just allow him to run routes. Just allow him to use his intelligence and nous to get open down the field. But if you had to present these 3 wide receivers and say, hey, I'm picking someone in fantasy, even though I turned Poet Sears and Sages down, but that's a different question about where he fits as a flex player. If you had to sit each of them down and talk about them as players, I think that DJ Moore irregardless of experience, profiles as someone who I would like. And it's just because of that ability, like I said, to line up anywhere. I'm not saying that it will project for the lion's share of the targets in the Bears wide receiver setup, because I can't really project that. I don't necessarily know what they want to do with the future of this team. But it definitely speaks for something to have that experience and to understand what this offense might want to look like as it enters a new horizon. And so you can make of this what you will, because it really is going to be a hard wide receiver room to diagnose. But that's just my 2 cents. Let me know what you think in the comments. That will just about do it for today's edition of the show. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you all for your lovely comments. I've been Christopher Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you have not already. Huge support to all concerned. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to stream their shows. Check us out on all social media platforms. But like I said, this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Christopher Shepard. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow, same time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, with another great show. Thank you all for tuning in.